So in order to determine what the source of a problem is, when you run a command and an error is thrown, Visual Studios will either in the Package Management Console or the error list tell you information about the error that it encountered. It is important to read these errors that are passed back to us because it'll often tell us where to look in order to fix those errors. Sometimes the problem might not actually be with your code, but might actually be with a library that Visual Studios is using. This is why it's important to know how to debug these issues and why I'm leaving in this issue for you to see the thought process that goes through me solving it and understanding what's happening. Because you're going to run into these, and it's usually the issues that you never encountered before and try to figure out that take up the most time in developing an application outside of the approach. So by showing you what I do, hopefully you'll be able to apply this later on in order to solve the unique issues that you encounter. So this is one way to go about it. As you can see, Visual Studios, or Entity Framework in this case, sent back an error. It said fail and the command that failed to run. So if we look at the red segment of the message that was printed out to us, it says failed executing DB command, 15 microseconds, blah, blah, blah. So next it showed us a bunch of SQL. And if we look at the end of that SQL, we can see it tried to alter the table ASP.NET user tokens and alter a column and change its type to nvarchar 128. When previously, if we look at the identity migration that initially created the tables, it did not define the actual size of the columns. So now let's look at the database, and we can see in the actual database table, ASP.NET user tokens that's trying to be modified, the actual size of the columns is 450 rather than 128. And because there is a primary key defined on these columns, which brings me to a new point. Previously, I said primary keys have to be defined on a single column to simplify things. But in some cases, you could have multi-column primary keys, and the combination of those columns have to be unique. So in this case, what's happening is that we have a primary key on those columns, and the entity framework is trying to modify the size of it, which it definitely does not like. So the database is complaining. So this is actually, in my opinion, an issue with how entity framework is generating the migration scripts. So there is no reason why that should happen or why those tables should be modified, why the identity framework table should be modified, since we didn't make any changes to them. Consequently, I'm going to modify the identity migration script, which shouldn't be done usually. But this seems to be an issue with how entity framework is generating its migration scripts in this case. So we can see the old value was nvarchar of 450 and is trying to change the max length to 128. So that's where the error is being thrown. There might be a better way to solve this, but for the case of moving it forward, I'm just going to delete the modifications to the identity framework tables in both our up script and our down script to prove to you guys that what is an issue is actually an issue. So if we look at each of this code segment, it says any table that is being modified that starts with ASP.NET, ASP.NET is the identity framework table. So we'll remove those migrations. Okay, press Shift, select them all. And I have just deleted from the up script the modifications. And now from the down script, I will do the same. So remember, if you can recall, the up function is what is used to apply changes to the database. The down is used to revert them. So now that I modified this migration to remove the changes to the actual identity framework tables, if we were to type in update-database, it should work without any issues. So it's running, and it's done. So in this case, we encountered an issue with the generation of entity framework migration scripts. It happens. Sometimes you'll be working with a library that has flaws, and you'll find a way to trigger it. So now if we look at our table, our database in SQL Server Management Studios, and refresh the notes table by right-clicking on it and selecting Refresh in Object Explorer, we'll see a new column has been added, User ID, and this points to our ASP.NET Users table. So now we have successfully modified the notes model to be pointing to the user table. Now we have to add in the functionality, because if we look at the records in the table, there are no records. So we need, for the new records that are created, we need to associate each of the records with a user.